Hello Overclockers, I'm 8Pack. I'm here today to talk to you guys about the new Sapphire Rapids Intel platform and the associated CPUs. What we're going to be looking at is stock performance, overclocking performance, cooling, power draw, and a bit about the general feature of the motherboard and chipset. So, that all being said, don't switch off right now, and let's get into it. Right, firstly, let's discuss a little bit about Sapphire Rapids and what it is. Basically, it's Intel's brand new Ultimate Workstation solution and is designed by them to compete with Threadripper Pro. So essentially, it's high-end desktop stroke server. There are 7 new Intel Xeon W3400 processors within the range of Sapphire Rapids. These CPUs have up to 112 CPU PCI Express Gen 5 lanes, up to 105 megabytes of L3 cache, and up to 56 performance cores. With these CPUs, you have different architecture to say 13th gen or your standard 12th gen. Every single core is a performance core, and these do not have any efficiency cores whatsoever. Basically, Intel's Sapphire Rapids Extreme Core Count Silicon is used here, and this Extreme Core Count Silicon features Intel EMIB packaging to connect 4 separate silicon dies together onto the same CPU package. This basically means because you're connecting 4 separate dies, you can have much greater core counts and expansion. And this expansion, of course, translates into memory, channels and capacity, and also PCI Express lanes. As we've already said, 112 CPU PCI Express lanes at Gen 5, which is pretty crazy. Also, alongside this, we have a totally new extension called AMX x86. This is Intel Advanced Matrix Extensions, and it's a new built-in accelerator that basically improves deep learning training. And how the CPUs are really gaining from this is because of very low latencies between the cores and between the dies. I have to disclaim and say I've not tested that. In fact, I did not test this extension at all because I could not find any suitable synthetic benchmarks to try it in. We have sold some systems after this video, if you like, that have been used in deep learning, but again, I haven't verified how good this extension is or not for those either. So for my testing of Sapphire Rapids, basically I tested the 3 top-end SKUs. I tested the 3495X, which is a 56 core part. I tested the 3475X, which is a 36 core part. And I tested the 3465X, which is a 28 core part. The pricing for those parts are 56 cores, around 6.3K, 36 core, around 4K, and 28 core, around 3K. Now, what was obviously important for me about these parts is the X SKU, and on the X SKU of all these parts you can basically overclock, and obviously I wanted to see how the CPUs would A, overclock, B, what cooling they need to overclock, and C, how much power draw they would have from overclocking. Obviously, basically, each one of these CPUs is a Xeon in the first instance, and Xeons are known for low clock speed, low power draw, and low temperatures. But when you add the X, this is where it gets really interesting, because I wanted to see how much performance extra I could get out of by overclocking. So we've discussed a little bit about the CPU stack. Now let's discuss about the motherboards that accept the Sapphire Rapids CPU. All these motherboards are W790 chipset motherboards, and we've got manufacturers including Asus, ASRock and Supermicro all announcing models. Asus, we've got the Pro WS W790 Ace, which is a quad channel motherboard. ASRock, we've got a W790WS, which is also a quad channel motherboard. And Asus, we've got a Pro WS W790E Sage SE, which is actually an octo or 8 channel motherboard. These motherboards are on various form factors, and you will need a large case to accommodate the form factors. They're EATX, CEB, or EEB form factor. So that is really for a large case. I mean, CEB and EEB are all larger than EATX, and we already know from like extreme motherboards that we have for Threadripper or 13th gen that EATX is a large size that needs a large case. The socket that accommodates the CPU is LGA 4677. Now the CPU socket does not have a clamping mechanism to hold the CPU in place. It's entirely held in place by the pressure placed on it by the CPU heatsink. So obviously be very, very careful when you're removing the heatsink from the CPU, as the CPU can often become stuck to the heatsink by the thermal paste, and then if you're not careful can drop back into the socket and damage the socket. So that's important. You must be careful when changing CPUs and changing coolers on this particular platform. The test boards I used for all my testing were the ASRock, which we've already said is W790WS quad channel, and the top of the line Asus board, which was the Sage SE. That's an 8-channel board. Now the VRM design on all these boards is very, very, very robust, and they're all fitted with very chunky VRM cooling modules, all with very small fans attached. Now the only problem with these fans obviously is when you put in the 56 core under extreme load, the fans are spinning very quickly and they are quite noisy, but they are absolutely essential. On an 8-channel system with a 56 core overclocked, you can be pulling like 13 or 1400 watts rendering. So like really a crazy VRM power draw, and for that you need 2 PSUs. Right, now we've discussed the CPUs and the motherboards, let's discuss about the memory used in these systems. So the memory I used for testing was DDR5 RDIMM by Crucial, which had a JDEC value of 4400 MHz, but an XMP of 4800 MHz. Now I was testing this stuff fairly early on the product lifespan. I know it's still early now, but even earlier, if you like, there was no higher XMP speeds out there. So I had 4400 to test and 4800 to test basically, and I had memory capacities between 64 gig all the way up to 256 gig, using either 4 sticks or 8 sticks of differing capacities of memory. With this, obviously this is the first DDR5 RDIMM platform, and it is such that because Intel wanted to offer very, very large memory capacities. Obviously the motherboards here all have IPMI, BMC functionality and are very much at home in the server environment as well as the high-end desktop environment. Obviously the high-end server area, the market, sometimes does require crazy memory capacities. So we've got 8 channels of DDR5 RDIMM memory support all the way up to 4 terabytes of memory capacity. The higher memory bandwidth and these higher memory speeds gained by using DDR5 is obviously going to be better for memory intensive applications. As far as speed recommendations go, just like non-server grade DDR5, I found that the 4400 and 4800 MHz speeds throughout my benchmarks, which were Blender, Viri, Corona Bench, and all these professional benchmarks, I didn't even see 1% improvement by increasing the clock speed by 10%. So 4400 effectively was equal to 4800 MHz, and I suspect this will be the case all the way up to about 6000 or 6400 MHz, where you might start to see a benefit. In terms of the channels or the channels of motherboard, now the difference in performance between going from 4 channels to 8 channels was between 3 and 5% depending on what I was running, but that 3 and 5% performance also translated into a massive gain in power pulled by the CPU to run all 8 channels and a massive gain in heat that the CPU was outputting. So you were talking about 5 or 6 degrees extra on the CPU in terms of temperature when we are running full out testing, even on a very high-end water cooling solution. And we were also talking about another 200 or 300 watts of power pull as well. So let's look at the cooling I used for this benchmarking. Basically, I used a 360mm rad with 3 2400 RPM fans, a D5 pump for plenty of flow, and the new EK water block that's designed specifically for these CPUs in this particular socket. And what I was basically doing was overclocking the CPUs as high as they possibly could go, with remaining temperatures between 90 and 100 C as an absolute maximum after 1 hour of solid rendering. So I'm pretty sure all the CPUs I tested could go higher than the overclocks I gained, but only with better than 360mm radiator capacity to ensure that the temperatures were kept under check. The IHS on these CPUs is very efficient and very large, so it basically means the more cooling you throw at it, the higher you can go, with the ceiling, I guess, at that point then becoming the temperature of the VRM. Now, the VRMs on these motherboards are very substantial, and in terms of the design and engineering, and they're also very substantial in terms of the cooling. They all have small fans mounted to them, very large heat sinks. But even then, when you're overclocking the 56-core CPU, these heat sinks get very hot, such that I added a 120mm fan myself to the Asus board to keep this extra cool. Now, why I didn't need to probably do this on the ASRock board was the ASRock board is a quad channel, and under the quad channel overclocking, the 56 core is pulling about 900 watts, so it's not pulling anywhere near as much as when you're running all octo channel. In octo channel, it's pulling around 1200, maybe even slightly more than 1200 watts, and of course putting much more stress on the VRM. So for me, I personally limited the overclocking here by saying most people can fit a 360 rad in their case, so I will just try with a 360 rad. As soon as I get to 90 degrees or above, I will not push the CPU any further. But if in the office, I have since added even more cooling. I've tried with quad rads, with double 360 rads, and been able to then go higher, at which point then the VRM cooling starts to become, if you like, the limiting factor. What I can report was that these CPUs, once overclocked, performed really, really crazy well. Right, we've covered the cooling. Now let's look at the most important thing, performance. Well, this is not that exciting either, because we're going to cover stock performance first. So when I'm testing these CPUs, I'm running 4 different benchmarks. The OCUK Blender Render Can Test, Cinebench R23 in both the single threaded benchmark and the multi-threaded benchmark. I'm running Corona Bench 1.3, which is again essentially a rendering benchmark, and I'm also running V-Ray. There's a large price difference between the 3 CPU cores, and what I wanted to check really is those prices justified in performance? What we saw was the 56 core at stock was 27% faster than the 36 core, and the 36 core was 12% faster than the 28 core. So even though you're getting a considerable price difference going up the stack, that price difference does actually translate into performance in this given instance. Right, now let's go on to the pecs of the video. Yeah, the real meat, and show what the stock performance was versus the overclocking. Now, these CPUs have absolutely comprehensive overclocking support. The CPUs are totally unlocked in terms of the multiplier. They can be controlled at software level by XTU, which is Intel's Extreme Tuning utility. They have processor core tuning for each individual cores, or even a set of cores. For the 4 different dies that are on the CPUs, you can tune each set independently. They all have Intel Turbo Boost tuning, as you'd expect. The DDR5 XMP 3.0 RDIMM modules can be overclocked via XMP, and you've got AVX2, AVX512, and the new X negative ratio offset type of tuning, with indeed mesh tuning and also cache tuning as well. Your cache ratio you can push up and down. So pretty much everything, every variable within the CPU is unlocked and tunable. And alongside that, you've got a massive array of voltage tuning settings that you can also do to help you to control the temperature of the CPU, to push every core to its highest possible ratio, and so on and so on. Now, what I did for this was make a few basic settings, if you like, in BIOS to do with VCCIN load limit, load calibration, and so on. I also did the memory setup in BIOS, and I did the power limit setup in BIOS. Then I went into Windows and used XTU, to be honest, to gain the best settings for each individual CPU before then translating them back to BIOS for what you'd call a 24/7 overclock. So that's how I came up with the best settings, if you like, for each CPU. Now, I will advise anyone doing this that you're going to need pretty high load line calibration on the VCCIN, certainly larger than you'd expect. So, how far could we overclock these CPUs, and what were the benchmark scores or improvement over stock? On the W9-3495X, which is the 56 core part, we were able to run all our benchmark suite at 4.3 GHz with the stability that I outlined before. So certainly less than 100 degrees and only slightly over 90, able to run any type of rendering or very heavy load for at least an hour. That was the stability testing. Now Blender and everything on this 3495X, we ran at 4.3 gigahertz. Blender at this clock speed offered 37% faster performance than stock. Cinebench offered 48% higher than stock. Corona offered 33% higher than stock. And finally, V-Ray offered 47% higher than stock. So overall, our 4.3 gigahertz overclock on the 3495X 56-core part gave us a 41% performance increase over stock, which is a really great result in all honesty. Right, now let's look at our 3475X. This is the 36-core part, and we were able to overclock this to 4.5 gigahertz against a stock frequency. And what we noticed in this was that Blender gained 35% in performance, Cinebench gained 48% in performance, Corona gained 31% in performance, and V-Ray gained 38% in performance. So at 4.5 gigahertz, the CPU overclockers gained us a massive 38% in performance. Again, a really big chunk of performance from overclocking. Finally, the W7 3465X, which is the 28-core part, we saw a 4.6 gigahertz overclock on this one. When we versus stock, we improved our Blender score by 31%, we improved our Cinebench score by 42%, we improved Corona by 28%, and we improved V-Ray by 36%. So on the 28-core part, we saw an overall improvement of 34% through overclocking the CPUs. Again, obviously, as we're coming down the number of cores, we're coming down the power requirements, we're gaining headroom. You know, the less cores, normally the higher you can overclock, and that's always going to be the case because you're pulling less power, you're creating less temperatures, and at the same time, you're relying on outlying cores to be higher binned. So if you've got 56 cores, basically you need all the 56 cores to be able to run at 4.6 for that CPU to go to 4.6. Whereas on a 28-core CPU, you only need 28 cores to be able to go to 4.6 for it to be stable at 4.6, if you get what I'm trying to get at here. So the lower number cores are putting a lot less stress on the VRM, and because there are a lower number of cores, you've got a much better chance of that lower number of cores to go to a higher frequency, and that's what we're seeing here. 56-core part 4.3, 36-core part 4.5, 28-core part 4.6. Overclocking these CPUs make a huge difference to performance. The difference is more dramatic the more cores that you have. Of course, the 56 cores base frequency is only 1.9 gigahertz. So going from a multi-core loading of 1.9 gigahertz all the way up to 4.3 gigahertz, that's a massive amount. And therefore, this is why we see these crazy high benchmark results and crazy high improvement. However, of course, with 56 cores or even 28 cores, when you're overclocking this, you need the best possible cooling that you can throw at the system. And on 56 cores on a motherboard with octo channel, you're going to need two high-powered PSUs to run the CPU and the rest of the system. So, in conclusion, my final thoughts about this CPU is the performance on the CPU is great, but only when you have the cooling within the case, the correct amount of power supplies, and the knowledge of how to overclock these to a stable maximum frequency. Then obviously they're gaining so much performance, they make absolute sense. Who are these for? Well, they're basically for end users who can take advantage of massively multi-core environments, or of course, for those who need the PCI Express lanes for maybe multi-GPU, such as AI or deep learning, or they need the PCI Express lanes for a lot of NVMe RAID storage arrays, especially like Gen 5 RAID NVMe storage arrays. Then they would also run crazy fast on this particular platform. People who are doing a lot of modeling, data scientists, software developers, these are the kind of things these CPUs are very useful for. So I suggest if you're gaming, you choose certainly a different platform and certainly a different CPU. So finally, if you want to buy one of these CPUs, you can certainly do so in any of the 8-pack systems that are suitable for this. which of course currently is a Supernova. They would also fit in the Polaris, and we've got a new system coming very soon called Dominate that will also be able to accommodate these crazy high-end CPUs and give you maximum cooling and maximal performance. And obviously if you buy the 8-pack system, they will be pre-overclocked, pre-tested and pre-tuned to gain the absolute maximum for your investment. We also offer these CPUs in a range of render servers which are suitable for the data center environment where people need the absolute maximum multi-core performance, maximum memory capacity for all their daily needs, for example simulation, etc. And finally, of course, don't like the video, please don't subscribe to the channel, but do check out the meat on this spicer. Look at the peaks.